Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have law school admissions consultant Anna Ivey back with us to talk about some timely admissions topics, including how to deal with being on a law school waitlist. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have law school admissions consultant Anna Ivey back with us to talk about some timely admissions topics, including how to deal with being on a law school waitlist. So welcome, Anna.
Hi, Alison. It's nice to be back.
It's so nice to be back. I cannot believe it's been as long as it has been.
Crazy.
So to start us off, can you just give our listeners a little bit of information on your background so they have some context to where you're coming from?
Sure. So I'm Anna Ivey. I'm the founder of Ivey Consulting, an admissions consulting firm, and I'm the former dean of admissions at the University of Chicago Law School. I also practiced law for a bit before I went into admissions. So I've seen the process from every angle, as an applicant, as a law student, as a lawyer, and as an admissions officer, and now as an admissions advisor. So hit me with anything. I want to hear all your questions, whatever is on your mind.
Yeah, that's why I'm really excited to talk to you. And we actually talked pretty early on in a couple of podcasts in the pandemic.
We did.
One of them in June of 2020, which both seems like yesterday and about 12 years ago. And what some of the things we talked about were the changes we might see in law school as a result of COVID. And I don't want to say we were prescient, but we were correct about a lot of things that, amazingly enough, actually seemed to be in dispute at that point. Such as, for example, whether law schools would be in person or not for fall of 2020, which apparently some people thought they would be. Suffice it to say, they weren't. Do you think it's fair to say that at least that part of law school has pretty much normalized at this point and people can expect to be back on campus full time for the upcoming fall?
I do think so. I think the law school experience has normalized and settled, although I would think and hope that law schools are also now better equipped than they were before the pandemic to deliver a legal education in more accessible ways than the old model. So lots of people hated online, right? I mean, we heard from a lot of people who hated online and they were pretty miserable with it. And I also am in touch with professors who, it was a learning curve for them how to teach online or teach in a hybrid model. This was difficult for them too. But what was really interesting to me is that some students found that they did better with the online model, it turns out. So, for example, people with social anxiety, some neurodivergent folks. So there were a lot of haters out there, but I think some people benefited from it too. And so, I think law schools now have more experience and better platforms and maybe a greater imagination about how to work with different kinds of students. But I think it is mainly going back to in-person, which most people are happy about, I think.
Yeah. No, we definitely talked to a lot of students who were really struggling with not having access to office hours and things like that and just staying engaged on like the endless Zoom. I mean, I definitely have talked to some people right now, kind of in the spring, who are still hybrid, but it seems like we're kind of getting back into, although I think your point is a good one about, maybe there are things they could learn from this to actually improve going forward. Even if it's something as simple as letting people like Zoom into the classroom if they can't be there for the day or something, they have a sick kid at home, that kind of thing. So, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, we will find out. But I think this does open up some access doors that perhaps they weren't considering before, and COVID sort of forced their hand. So I'll be very curious to see to what extent they leverage what they learned during the pandemic to increase access for different kinds of students with different kinds of delivery models. So I'm paying attention, and I'm curious to hear from students and professors. My ear is always to the ground. I'll be curious what they think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question I hadn't actually thought about. Have you seen any major changes in admissions as a result of the pandemic?
Well, it certainly got more competitive. A lot more
Hmm,
people applied to law school than pre-pandemic, and more specifically, more people applied from the really high LSAT ranges during the
interesting.
pandemic. So that had ripple effects through the whole system. And people with the really high LSAT scores, they come in and out of the pool in cycles, depending on what else is going on in the world, what other options they have, what they want to do with their lives. So when they show up in droves, as they did during the pandemic, that affects the whole system. So that allowed law schools to ratchet up their selectivity. So that came as a shock to a lot of applicants who were really normed around admissions data from the era before the pandemic. So that was a shock to a lot of applicants. But yeah, they most of them found law school homes that they're happy at. But it is, I would say, the competitiveness has dropped off a bit this cycle that we're still in.
Huh.
It's a bit softer, but it is still not back to the pre-pandemic baseline. So it is still harder than before COVID in terms of the competitiveness, but not quite as Hunger Games like as that that first cycle during COVID.
Right, 'cause my understanding before the pandemic was they weren't getting those applications necessarily from the stronger applicants, and that was concerning to the schools.
Yeah, as I say, there are cycles that law schools are used to. Usually, the application volume and sort of profiles of the kinds of applicants they get are counter-cyclical with the economy. But
Right.
we had a once in a century pandemic, so boom, that dropped like a bomb. As I say, big ripple effects through the whole system, affected every school. It affected every applicant.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we then see that later on when we, have looking at like bar passage rates and things. And so you're like, well, what
Mhm.
happened? It's like, well, 5 years earlier, you started admitting students who had like lower
Yeah,
LSATs.
you very often
Um,
see that direct line, and it's one of those things that I think some people don't want to focus on because it's depressing, which is that there is this
right.
correlation between LSAT scores and bar passage rates. And I'm not a huge defender of bar exams or that system. I've
I
taken
mean, I'm
two.
not either, to be honest.
I've taken California. I've taken Louisiana. God
Oh,
help
you
me.
did?
Yeah, I
How
did.
interesting. Those
Oh
are like,
yeah,
yeah, that was not what I thought you were going to say for your second one.
civil law. Neither of them is particularly easy in the grand scheme of things, I would say. And so, I've been there, done that, but as some sort of test to ensure someone's fitness to practice law, I have my doubts about that system. So I don't go to great lengths to defend the bar exam, but I do think applicants need to understand that if they are very low scorers on the LSAT, um, I do have some concerns about their prospects for passing the bar exam. And of course, legal practice is a cartel. It's a legal
Right.
cartel, right? It's a legalized cartel. But without bar membership, you cannot practice this profession. And so that's a huge investment of time and money and heartburn, right?
Yeah,
To go to law school and then not be able to pass the bar exam is really a, a difficult outcome, right? So it's
definitely.
something to be mindful of for low scorers. There is that correlation, and you brought it up. You've seen it. There's that lag between when schools lower their standards where the LSAT is concerned, and then you see it in the bar passage rates X number of years later. So it's a depressing line that connects the two, but I think we need to be mindful of it, especially if we're advising people as they go into this process.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. The bar exam is sort of ridiculous. And to be fair, it is possibly shifting in, the not so immediate future, like 5 to 10 years or less.
Mhm, mhm.
But, and I think the schools could be doing a lot more with the students who come in who they know may struggle.
Yeah,
But, if someone is in that position, I just say, like, look, from the beginning, you've got to recognize that you've
yes,
never been great at standardized testing, and there is a big standardized test looming at the end of this experience. So do what you need to do in school to make sure that you've developed kind of the study skills and the writing skills that you have a pretty good shot at passing this because, like you said, you cannot practice until you do it,
right. And it's
which is a
like any
problem.
test, and it's a standardized test. It is learnable.
Yeah.
And so I think if people know this going in, they have 3 years to get the help they need, right?
Right.
To learn how to tackle this thing. Some law schools are very explicitly teaching to the test. The fancier law schools do not teach to the test.
They
Uh,
don't even mention it really.
um, but at a lot of law schools, as I say, you have 3 years to wrap your arms around this thing. So take advantage of that and get the outside help that you need, because otherwise that investment just kind of circles the drain, and that's the worst of all
Yeah.
possible outcomes.
It's really sad.
Yeah.
Someone who just like is really struggling and can't do
Hmm.
this, and it's like,
Hmm.
maybe you should have listened in the beginning and like thought about this to start with. But
Yeah,
it is
not
just a
everyone has
test,
the
and
information that they need when they need it, right?
no,
So
definitely not. I mean,
we
I
just
went to a
try to meet
fancy
people where they
school.
are, right? We all try to meet people where they are. And so, if people are listening to this podcast and heading into law school soon, then they still have time to come up with a strategy, is the important thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's very doable. It's just very hard to do in like 2 months after you've graduated. It's much easier
Yeah.
to like develop a lot of these skills and the knowledge over the course of 3 or 4 years when you're in law school.
Oh,
All
I
right. Well,
remember. I remember for the bar exam, I I had never taken wills and estates in law school.
oh yeah,
I
I
had
didn't
one day
either.
to study it, and I just hoped that it wasn't one of the subjects that came up during my bar exam administration. I was like, if it shows up, I'm in trouble. I'm rolling the dice here. I have one day to cram this stuff, and that's the silliness of this test, right? Is
Oh, it's ridiculous.
that's kind of the
I mean,
stuff you have to do, right?
well, I would say if you did what you're asked to do on the bar exam in practice, you would definitely be committing malpractice. you
That's
know?
exactly right.
I mean,
I do
like,
not hire me or come to me with your trusts and estates questions. Thank you very much.
exactly. Like I was a patent litigator. That's not on the bar. Like literally everything I did is not on the exam. Maybe a little Civ Pro.
Exactly.
Um, and for somebody to come in and be like, my friend just got arrested. Like, what should they do? I'm like, I don't know. Call a criminal defense lawyer. Why are you asking me this?
Well, and it's very focused on, I think, future litigators. So for future
Mm-hmm.
transactional lawyers, there's not a whole lot going on. I'm sure that varies from state to state, but
Well, not really.
anyway, we don't have to belabor the bar exam. But I think you're right to encourage people to be thinking ahead to the bar exam while they are in law school, so that um, they're not staring this huge exam down at the end of
Right.
law school when they don't have much time.
Yeah. And, people just get blindsided sometimes. Like, I've always
Mhm.
had like extra time. It's like, well, then you're probably going to need extra time to study, don't you think? you know?
True, true.
Anyway, well, let's shift gears because it's supposed to be about admissions, not the
Yes.
bar. And I want to talk to you a little bit about a very timely topic for, unfortunately, a
Mhm.
lot of law school applicants right now, which is waitlist. So,
Yes.
how does this work? Like, what is the
Mhm.
time frame for schools making decisions and that kind of
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah. So let me start with the bigger context, because I think some of that is specific to this era that we're in. I think because of that big jump in application volume in the previous cycle, a lot of law schools are feeling gun shy about the risk of
Hmm.
over enrolling people, extending too many offers
Right.
than they have room for when those deposits come back. So, from where I sit, my vantage point, I see them during this cycle keeping even deeper wait lists than pre COVID. And wait lists were really deep already before COVID.
Hmm.
So, I think they're getting even more risk averse because of that crazy cycle we had before the current one. But I think in some cases, they're keeping these really deep wait lists also because I think at a lot of schools, the admissions offices are just overextended. They've been
Hmm.
understaffed since COVID started. And that's not just law school, that's across the board. That's happening at undergrad, for example, too. So I think the admissions offices are facing real challenges trying to get caught up with the application volume. So even though that volume has softened a bit, as I say, it's still up compared to pre-COVID. So that is the larger context in which this waitlist cycle is happening right now. To your earlier question, waitlists stay open until orientation,
Hmm.
because when people put down their deposits first in April, and then usually there's a second deposit deadline sometime in the summer, there are people who put down deposits who either just don't show up, happens all the time, happens every year. Somebody just doesn't show up for orientation and they have a seat to fill. Um, or more likely there's this game of musical chairs that happens every summer where a person has put down a deposit, gets off a wait list somewhere else, decides to, go deposit over there at the new school. Well, that opens up a seat at the first school. So now that first school has to turn to its wait list and pull someone off who's deposited yet somewhere else. So it's just this huge game of musical chairs all summer long until literally orientation. So you could get that call anytime between now and orientation. So here's the really important thing to remember. You, the applicant, you drive this bus. You have agency here. You get to decide when you want to stay on a wait list and when you want to let it go. So you have to be really honest with yourself about which schools, compared to whatever offers you already have and where you've put down a deposit, which waitlist schools are you willing to rearrange all your plans for potentially very late in the game? You've probably already signed a lease somewhere. You might have already moved by that point. You might have a significant other who's had to upend their lives to go to that first school location. You'll have to find housing in the new place. So probably you want to be really picky about what schools you're willing to upend your life for late in the game. And so
No, I think
keep that agency in mind. That is your decision. You do not have to stay on these wait lists. You get to decide when enough is enough and you want to just move on with your life and your planning.
Yeah, I actually saw this from both sides at Columbia. The first year I was there, I had a 3-bedroom apartment, and they told me, like, oh, this is your third roommate, and this person just never showed up. We never
Mm-hmm.
heard from her, we nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
this is weird. Later, like, somebody told me she went to Harvard. And then on the flip side, there was an open space the next year in my apartment. And because actually my then another roommate had transferred to Harvard. And one
I'm
day,
sensing a pattern here.
yeah, exactly. One day, literally, somebody just opened the door, and it was a situation of like, "Hi, how do you have a key to my house?"
Mhm.
So it's like 3 weeks into the semester or something, and she
Yeah.
was like, "Well, I'm a 1L, and like they just found me housing. I've been couch surfing for like 3 weeks with friends in
Yeah.
New York, and like I'm your new roommate." I'm like, "Welcome. Would you
Right.
like a cup of tea?"
And I'm guessing she got off the Columbia wait
Yeah,
list late
she
in the game,
did.
right? She was
Yeah,
deposited somewhere
exactly.
else, had already arranged
Yep.
her housing wherever that was, right?
Yeah, I can't even remember where she was supposed to, like, Georgetown or something. So
Yeah.
then she got in at Columbia and, like, it was basically homeless for almost a month,
Yeah.
until finally they located that we had an empty room because somebody else had moved out. It was a complete, like, musical chairs, as you
Yeah,
said.
exactly. And that's going to go on until orientation starts and they actually do the head count, who actually showed up.
Yeah, so crazy.
Hmm.
Well, for somebody who is on a wait list and they wanna get off of it, what should they be thinking about or doing at this point kind of in the spring?
Yeah. So once you've decided which wait lists you want to fight for, and you probably shouldn't fight for all your wait lists, like really be honest with yourself. Which ones would you actually accept over whatever offer you already have and where you're depositing, about a month from now? Um, which ones do you want to fight for? And the ones you want to fight for, you need to be staying on their radar. So you're going to be checking in with them, and we can talk about the best ways to do that and at what frequency. But the number one thing that is the most effective as far as improving your odds of getting off of a wait list that you care about is to basically pre-commit yourself. You tell them, if I were to receive an offer, I would accept it immediately. And then here's the real nuance. And you have to go a step further. And I would withdraw everywhere else. Because otherwise, if you don't make that promise to withdraw everywhere else, you're just accepting their offer. You might hightail it out of there again 3 weeks later when you got off another wait list, right?
Exactly. They have no reason to trust you, really.
So it's a two-part commitment. Not only would I accept an offer if I were fortunate enough to receive one, but I would also immediately withdraw everywhere else. And the reason that has the most power to affect your odds is because put yourself in the shoes of an admissions officer. That's always my larger goal, is to sort of teach people how to think like an admissions officer, right? Because that's the audience that matters
Right.
for your application purposes. From their perspective, if they have a spot that they need to fill, it means they have to fill it quickly. right? In a waitlist
Hmm.
scenario because of that musical chairs situation. So they've got very, very deep wait lists. So how do they decide whom to pick? So there are numbers that they have to manage, demographics, all that stuff is out of your control. But all else being equal, they would rather call the person who has already pre-committed herself,
Hmm.
right? It just makes the admissions officer's life easy or easier, I
And
should say.
maybe I'm being cynical here, but can the schools actually know that you've withdrawn other places?
Um, I don't know that they would have a way of finding that out. Um, and I don't know that it's any of their business, frankly.
Yeah, I didn't know
So
if there was kind of a list they could check where it's
yeah,
like, all
no,
right, that,
law schools used to share a lot more information about applicants until the antitrust authorities came sniffing
hmm
around and told them to
yeah,
knock
that's
it
what I
off.
was thinking. I've had a vague
So
memory of that.
yeah, yeah. So that has been a changing landscape. So they're not allowed to share information that the way they used to do. But as I say, because your goal on a wait list that you care about, your goal is to make it as easy as possible for that admissions officer to call you instead of many, many, many other people on the wait list when a spot opens up, when that spot has to be filled quickly, right?
Hmm.
So that is the number one thing you can do if you are willing to pre-commit yourself. If you're not willing to pre-commit yourself, obviously don't tell them that, right?
Right. I mean, you do want to have some integrity. You are going
Yeah.
into a legal
And you could get
profession.
into trouble. If you try to game the system and you fall on your face, they might withdraw the offer, right?
Right.
Um, let
You
alone
don't want to
down the
make anyone too
road.
angry.
Yeah, no, this is not this is definitely, as with all parts of the application, like you need to actually honor your word, right? So if you pre-commit yourself that way, you have to honor that commitment if you do get the call.
Hmm. All right. Well, is there any way for people to kind of figure out their odds of getting off a wait list? I mean, it seems like you can also kind of influence them a bit, but how do I figure out if it's like realistic for me to say, okay, I'm going to totally go and try to get off this wait list, or if it's just, like this is probably not really happening.
You can't. I mean, odds are slim no matter what. As I say, those
Right.
wait lists are really, really deep. But here's the thing, admissions officers don't even know because they have no idea
Hmm.
what that game of musical chairs is going to look like over
Right.
the, between now and orientation.
Yeah. Are they going to
So
have
for
10
admissions
people or are they going to
officers,
have 30 people?
yeah, they have no
Whatever.
idea. So admissions officers don't know, and so you don't know either, right?
Yeah.
Because there are just too many unknowns and variables there. So that's why you have to decide, are you willing to hang in there until orientation for a certain school? And if the answer is no, you know what? Let it go. You
Yeah. I
have
mean, I
the
think at some
agency.
point,
You have that decision making power, right? You don't have to let schools string you along like a bad ex, you don't.
right. And I think sometimes people do feel that way. Like there's just nothing I can do. Like, if they come calling, I have to say yes. It's like, no, you don't actually. You could decide that like, okay,
Mhm.
maybe you could upgrade a little bit in the rankings, but is that worth uprooting your entire life at
Right,
the very last minute? I don't know. For like, to
right.
go one place higher in the rankings. For some people, yes. For
And
some
I would
people, no.
argue, yeah, exactly. And I would argue it's better to kind of do that analysis before the call comes, just for your own
Oh, for
sake,
sure.
right? And then be very honest with yourself about whether you want to stay on that wait list. And that might change over the course of the summer, right? As more time passes and you get closer to starting school, you've already rearranged things in your life, So over the next several months, as more information comes back, you might decide, yes, I'm willing to stay on these three over here and I'm going to let all the others go.
Right. I mean, it's one thing too, if it's in a similar city or something, you've got one offer in Boston and now you've got another offer in Boston. It's like, all
Right,
right, well, I mean, maybe you have to like,
right.
it's not going to be the most convenient housing situation for a year or something, but like that's less
Yeah, it's
problematic
less
than
of a
like,
logistical
yeah,
challenge,
it's
right?
like you're in
Mhm,
Boston or you're in California.
mhm.
Those
Yeah,
are like very different.
exactly, exactly.
Um, yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, like kind of keeping in contact with a school. What is kind of fair game to send them and like how frequently? I mean, I'm assuming
Mhm.
people should not be annoying, but also, want to be doing something. Like, what should they do?
Um, So first of all, read the actual waitlist communication that they send you. I'm always amazed when people come to me and they say, "Oh, I'm on the waitlist at blah blah blah. What should I do?" And I'm like, "Well, read me the language. What are they telling you?" Because they have different rules. Some of them are opt in, others are opt out. Some of
Oh,
them invite
right.
you to send stuff right away. If I think it's University of Texas says you only get to send 3 letters and that's it, then you're maxed out, which means, so read the letters, follow the instructions. That would be my first number one tip for that, because there isn't just some generic process, right? So you as future lawyers, yes, read those communications carefully.
Yeah. Read the footnotes, read every part of it. It's good practice.
What do they say, right? So some of them invite, so-called expressions or letters of continued interest immediately, in which case, great. Others are less, or, are vaguer about it. But I think, so if we're in March now, heading into April, realistically, they're not going to turn to the wait list to fill spots until the second half of April, because they're going to wait and see what deposits come back for that April 15th deposit deadline. So I guess, is there some scenario in which they would go to the wait list before then? I guess hypothetically, but I think realistically, that's just not how that works. So if you want to send something now to remind them of your strong interest, you can do that. Otherwise, I would say you could start in mid-April. And then I would touch base with them on a monthly basis thereafter. You really don't need to contact them more than once a month. Yeah. And then
they haven't forgotten you exist.
They will not have forgotten that you're still interested, but do it on a monthly basis. The weakest level of that would be, I remain very interested. Thank you for considering, continuing to consider me. If you want to bump it up and improve your odds, you make that pre-commitment, right? So you have to decide what you want to put in that letter and what you're willing to live with, right? If you have updates, certainly you can include those about a new job or whatever the case may be. If it's anything school related, like, oh, I have a new transcript because the semester finished, that's actually a required update. That's not up to you to decide. And so then you have to actually submit an updated transcript to LSAC for processing, right? But even if you have no actual updates, that's fine. Just tell them you remain very interested. Thank you for continuing to consider me. These letters of continued interest end up sounding super repetitive, and that feels weird for people, but that's okay. Repetition is not a bad thing here, because you want to let them know that you're still interested. Keep me under consideration. Call me if a spot opens up, right? So repetition is not a bug in this scenario.
Mm-hmm. Is anyone retaking the LSAT at this point, or is that just totally baked in?
Some people do, and it's just not going to matter at this point, honestly.
Okay. I would assume they have to report whatever you applied with anyway, which is kind of what they care about.
Yeah, some people hedge their bets and think, well, if I end up reapplying, I'll just go ahead and take it. When it's a little bit earlier in the cycle, or if their application deadline hasn't passed yet, and it hasn't at some schools, that can actually foul up the application timeline for the current cycle, because at some schools, as soon as they see that you're even registered for an LSAT, they will put your file on hold, even if you already have an LSAT.
Interesting.
Yeah,
so you might end up not even on the wait list, but on hold.
I think it's incredibly lousy policy. I don't think they should have visibility into what tests you have registered for. You might never end up taking it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a lot of bones to pick with that. But it does happen at some schools. So in the current cycle, if the deadline hasn't passed yet and you're registering for a future LSAT, that can put a hold on your application, which is potentially not what you want.
Right. And if nothing else, it might suggest that you plan to reapply later. So maybe you're not really committed to that wait list you're claiming you'd get off of immediately and go.
It muddles things.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's talk about a little bit. One of the questions that I had for you is sort of when you might want to just reapply. So if I'm on my wait list, it's my dream school, doesn't look like I'm getting off of it. Does that have anything to say about whether I would be more likely to get admitted the next year if I apply again?
Not really. As I say, those wait lists are so deep.
It's not a good sign, not a great sign.
I actually appreciate the schools that don't just by default kick everyone onto a wait list and just pull the Band-Aid off and deny people, right? I actually have a lot of respect for that. But a lot of times they just, waitlist is sort of the next stage, if you don't get admitted, and they're just kicking
Yeah.
that can down the road for most people, right?
And it's kind of like,
Um,
you're moving. It's the yes, no, the maybe pile, and the maybe pile
yeah,
is like 80%. It's like you're probably not taking
yeah,
all that with you.
yeah. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that you got into a wait list before. I think if you're going to consider reapplying this coming fall, the really important thing to think about is, what are you going to do differently?
Right.
Because doing basically the same kind of profile, the same kind of application, and hoping for a different outcome is, I think, not a realistic way to go, right? And then
Mm,
you've just put your whole life on hold for another year for what,
right. To send the
So
same application to the
yeah,
same
so you have to really
school.
think about, like, what is it about your profile that you can improve for the next time around, right? And I
Hmm.
would say, since it's already March, you know what? If you want to apply nice and early this fall, you have to start getting your ducks in a row now, right?
Mm,
So it's tough when you're still waiting for decisions, and you might not get final decisions until, July. I get it. It's a tricky thing with the timelines, right? Um, but I think whatever school you have offers from by April 15, that is very likely where you would end up going, right? So if that is
yeah.
not where you want to actually go to law school, then you really need to start thinking ahead if you are planning to reapply, because it might involve, for example, retaking the LSAT, and
Hmm.
improving your LSAT takes time. That doesn't happen overnight,
Definitely.
right?
No, and also figuring out what you're going to do for the next year, and is that going to be
Mhm,
something that's going to position you to be a better
mhm,
applicant? I mean,
exactly.
I think your point about people really sitting with, okay, if this is my law school that I'm going to attend, does this make sense for me? Is
Mhm,
so important. I mean, I
mhm.
think we see so many people who frankly like necessarily haven't done that calculus, and then they kind of get into this and it's like not working out the way they thought, and it's just sort of, it's just sad to see. You want to see people who are going someplace that they're excited about and they're happy about, and they're willing to commit and do the work and like be successful, because otherwise this can just be a very expensive waste of time and money
Yeah,
and
and
energy.
and for some people, it ends up being financially catastrophic, which is,
Oh,
the
absolutely.
the certainly an unintended consequence. Yeah, I think for any school you put on your list to apply to, you have to be really honest with yourself. If that were, I would say, ask yourself, if that were the only school I got into, would I actually go?
Right.
And that might depend on, well, is it a full ride or is it full fare? So for some of that information, you have to apply and get in to find out, what the price tag
Hmm.
is, which is this sort of goofy aspect of the American higher education system, right? You don't even know what the price tag is until after all those steps. But I think for some people who are really disappointed with their outcomes during the Hunger Games year, the first year of the pandemic,
Right.
um, they ended up accepting whatever the best offer was at the time, and then were just horribly depressed during orientation when they actually showed up, because they felt like they were sort of above that school.
Right.
And it's like, you know, this is where you have to really think ahead of time. Would I actually go to that school? Because if the answer is no, why are you bothering?
Yeah. I mean, I could see, maybe you apply someplace like thinking you're going to get a scholarship to negotiate
Mhm,
with or something, but I do think you have to be pretty clear about like, would I show up to this?
mhm.
No. All right. At
And
least
and
you
be
know
honest with
that.
yourself about your own school snobbery, and I actually say that in a non-judgmental way. I think the world is school snobby. That is the world we live in, unfortunately. So if you think a certain school that you're slapping on your list as a safety school is somehow beneath you, and then you find yourself there during orientation having, an emotional breakdown, because it just violates your some aspect of
Your
your core
sense.
identity, then I would say, don't put yourself in that situation, right?
No, because the reality is if you're that miserable, you're probably not going to be performing well. So now you're
No,
not
I
even
don't know how you
performing well at
succeeded.
this
I don't
school
know
that
how
you
you
don't want to be
succeed in
at.
that environment. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not a great place to be, when you're doing poorly at a place that you think is
No,
beneath you.
but I get it. When you're just starting the process, it's not real yet, right?
Yeah.
When you're showing up for orientation, it's feeling very, very real, and it's
Right.
just a cognitive disconnect, I think, that we're all capable of, right?
Well, I think the other thing people find challenging sometimes is that everyone in your class is actually probably pretty competitive with you.
Well,
Like
that's it. If that was a tough year for everybody, well, this school you're at that you think is beneath you, you're surrounded by people who, are, are not necessarily inferior to you in any way, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like I think the curve can be a harsh reality for everyone, and certainly
Hmm.
for people who think that they're going to come in and this is going to be like a cakewalk, and they're
Hmm.
so like above everyone else and so much
Yeah.
smarter and blah. It's like that's not necessarily how this is going to play out. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, that's right. And people, I think it's very natural to think, oh, I'm gonna be the superstar in law school. Well, by definition, axiomatically, most people end up not being the superstar, right?
Right. No, I'm sure you've seen that study they did many years ago at this point. They asked students going into law school where they thought they were going to be in the class. And I think something like,
Yeah.
90% of them thought they'd be in the top half and like
Hmm.
50% of them thought they'd be in the top 10 or something. I'm making this up. But the basic gist of it
Yeah.
is like people have unrealistic expectations sometimes.
And you know even better than I do because this is what your practice is. Doing well in law school is not that closely correlated with what allowed you to succeed in undergrad. These are different.
No.
It's a whole different can of worms. And so I think one of the really risky things for people is to think, oh, I know how to do school. I did really well undergrad, so I know I'm going to do really well in law school. And it's like, no, this is just a different system, right?
It's a different game and it
It
rewards
is.
like a very specific type of thinking.
Yes.
And if you happen to be good at that type of thinking, then you're probably going to do pretty well. But for a lot of people who have done well in previous educational experiences that reward something different, this can be a real shock to the system.
Correct.
Well, we're running out of time. Before we wrap up, what about this idea people often have? Maybe this is also overconfidence. They can just start one place, like maybe it's not their ideal school, and just transfer.
Yeah,
How
well, that's the
realistic do you
perfect
think that is?
segue. That's the perfect segue because transfer admissions all comes down to 1L grades. So in that
Exactly.
sense, you do get a do-over because at that point, it's not about undergrad grades, it's not about LSAT, it's about your 1L performance. But because everyone goes to law school thinking they're going to do really, really well, I don't think a transfer play, assuming you want to transfer in order to, quote unquote, upgrade, right?
Right.
Um, for most people, they're not going to be the superstar. So I would never start at a law school that you wouldn't be okay graduating from.
I 100% agree with that. And we tell people that all
Yeah.
the time.
And the
Because I
other
think,
the other challenge is if they do end up applying, for example, say they drop out after their first week, right? They get there, they're like,
right,
"This is beneath me. This is horrible." No, they drop out after the first week. Well, guess what? When you reapply to law school, you have to disclose that as a prior law school enrollment. You can't just pretend it never happened,
right.
which freaks a lot of people out. They think they can just kind of sweep that under the rug, and no, you cannot.
Yeah, definitely. We sometimes get people like, oh, I did 1 year and now I just want to reapply. It's like, well, you
Mhm.
can do that, but you're going to have to
Mhm.
tell people and they're probably going to want to see your transcript,
Yeah, it's all going to be a required part of the process. So the minute you actually start law school somewhere, there are consequences if you decide you actually want to be somewhere else.
Right. So basically, sort out your wait list and everything else
Hmm.
before you show up for
Hmm.
orientation. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Any final thoughts you have on wait lists or anything else that we've talked about today?
Again, don't have to be you don't have to be drifting along with the current here, right? These larger
Yeah.
forces at work. Remember that you have the agency, you drag the bus, you get to make decisions about what the next several months are going to look like and what you're willing to fight for and when you want to call it a day. I can't emphasize that enough because I think it's very easy to slip into a more passive frame of mind with, just letting your life be dictated by, these schools keeping these very deep wait lists. So that's my little pep talk. Like, no, you're in charge here.
Right. And I think that's sort of the through line that we've had this entire conversation is at some point, people kind of have to make that commitment to this experience. And if they're in a position where they say, you know what, like I'm reasonably happy with where I can go, I'm going to pull myself from the wait list and focus on making this the best experience it can be. I think that's a much better scenario to be in than kind of this person who's like, I'm not really happy with this, but I'm going to see what happens. And then, like you said, you're just losing agency at that point. I don't think that helps the whole experience.
Right. Yeah. And this is your future. This is your life. Right.
Right. And, law school is 3 years of your life. Like, if you're really going to be miserable someplace, do not do it.
Right.
All right. Well, if people want to find out more about you and your work, how can they do that?
Yeah, so you can come to my website, which is annaivey.com. The only little hitch is remember that it's ivey.com. And there you'll find my blog, you'll find a link to my books, you'll find a sign up form for my newsletter. There's also a registration link for my upcoming law school admissions boot camp. If some of you are early birds and haven't even started applying to law school yet, that boot camp starts on April 19. And you can always just email us at law@annaivey.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Allison. It's always fun talking to you.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again soon. In fact, we could do a whole episode on how much we hate the bar exam.
I'm always.
But yeah, it's really been yeah, me too. All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.